Picture this. A teenage girl walks into a room full of men who think she's just another pretty face to marry off for political gain. 40 years later, she's rewritten the map of the world, funded the discovery of America, and oh yeah, expelled an entire religious population from her kingdom. Meet Isabella of Castile, a woman so contradictory she makes your ex look emotionally stable. She was devoutly religious yet ruthlessly political, a loving mother who arranged marriages like chess moves, and a queen who somehow managed to be both history's hero and villain in the same breath. Tonight we're diving into the life of a woman who proved that behind every great exploration, there's usually a very complicated woman with daddy issues and an unshakable belief that God is on her side. If you've ever wondered what happens when medieval girl boss energy meets religious extremism, you're in exactly the right place. Get comfortable. Let's start with something most history books conveniently forget to mention. Isabella wasn't supposed to be queen, at all. She was what medieval Spain politely called legitimate. But what everyone really meant was, oops, we didn't plan for this. Born in 1451, Isabella came into a world that had very specific ideas about women, power, and who got to make decisions. Her father, John II of Castile, was the kind of king who spent more time writing poetry than actually ruling, which sounds romantic until you realize his kingdom was basically falling apart while he perfected his sonnets. Think of him as a medieval Instagram influencer. Great content, terrible at actual work. Isabella's childhood was like being raised in a very expensive, very dangerous boarding school. Her mother, Isabella of Portugal, was dealing with what we'd now recognize as severe mental health issues, but in the 15th century they just called it melancholy and hoped she'd snap out of it. Imagine being a little girl watching your mother slip further and further away from reality while your father writes love poems to his favorites at court. The castle of Madrigal de las Altas Torres, where Isabella spent her early years, was less fairy tale princess and more gothic psychological thriller. The walls were thick, the corridors were cold, and everyone whispered about whether the queen would have one of her episodes during dinner. Isabella learned early that emotional stability was a luxury she couldn't afford. But here's where it gets interesting, and this is something that would shape everything about her future reign. While other noble girls were learning to embroider and look pretty, Isabella was getting an education that was, let's call it, unconventional. Her mother, during her lucid moments, insisted that Isabella learn to read and write fluently. This might not sound revolutionary to us, but in 1450s Spain, a literate woman was about as common as a unicorn with a business degree. Isabella devoured books on philosophy, theology, and history. She could debate religious doctrine with monks and discuss military strategy with knights. But more importantly, she was watching the political chaos around her with the sharp eyes of someone who knew she might need to navigate it herself someday. Her half-brother Enrique I was technically the heir, but he had a small problem. Everyone thought he was either impotent, gay, or both. His marriage to Blanche of Navarre had been annulled due to non-consummation, which was medieval code for this isn't working, and we're all pretending we don't know why. The court buzzed with rumors and speculation, and little Isabella absorbed it all like a sponge. When her father died in 1454, 3-year-old Isabella found herself in an even more precarious position. Enrique became king, but his court was a mess of competing factions, each trying to use the royal children as pawns in their political games. Isabella and her younger brother Alfonso became incredibly valuable commodities, not as people, but as potential marriage alliances and succession insurance policies. Picture being a child and knowing that your entire worth is measured by who might want to marry you and what kingdoms they could bring to the table. Every conversation about your future involves maps, treaties, and dowries. Every potential husband is evaluated not for kindness or compatibility, but for how many soldiers he can bring and which trade routes he controls. Isabella's teenage years were spent in this strange limbo, too important to ignore, too young to have any real power, and too smart not to understand exactly how precarious her position was. She watched Enrique struggle with rebellious nobles, a suspicious wife, and a daughter whose legitimacy everyone questioned. She saw how quickly alliances could shift, and how brutal the consequences could be for those who chose the wrong side. But here's what makes Isabella fascinating. Instead of becoming paranoid or bitter, she became calculating. She learned to read people the way others read books, to spot weakness and opportunity with equal precision. She understood that in her world survival wasn't just about being royal, it was about being indispensable. And slowly, quietly, she began to realize something that would change the course of history. She didn't want to just survive the Game of Thrones, she wanted to win it. The stage was set for one of history's most consequential power grabs, but nobody saw it coming. After all, she was just a teenage girl in a world run by men. What could possibly go wrong? If you think modern dating is complicated, try being Isabella of Castile. At 14, she wasn't swiping left or right. She was having her entire romantic future decided by men in rooms. She wasn't allowed to enter, based on criteria that had absolutely nothing to do with love and everything to do with military alliances. The marriage proposals started rolling in like medieval spam emails, each more politically motivated than the last. There was Charles of Burgundy, rich, powerful, and conveniently located for trade routes, but also old enough to be her father and about as charming as a tax collector. Pedro Girón, the master of Calatrava, was another option, despite being notorious for his flexible approach to celibacy vows. Then there was the King of Portugal, her own uncle, because apparently medieval royal families believed in keeping things uncomfortably close. But Isabella had been watching and learning, and she'd figured out something crucial. Whoever she married wouldn't just be choosing a husband, they'd be choosing the future King of Castile. This wasn't just about romance. This was about whether Spain would become a French satellite state, a Portuguese province, or something entirely new. Enter Ferdinand of Aragon, a prince who was everything the other candidates weren't. He was young, politically ambitious, militarily competent, and, here's the kicker, just as determined to rule as she was. Most importantly, he understood that Isabella wasn't looking for a husband who would rule for her, but one who would rule with her. The problem? Nobody with any real power wanted this marriage to happen. A union between Castile and Aragon would create a unified Spain that would be far too powerful for everyone's comfort. France definitely didn't want it. Portugal was horrified by the idea. Even Pope Paul II had issued a papal bull forbidding the marriage, because apparently the Pope had opinions about Spanish geopolitics. So naturally Isabella decided to do it anyway, because nothing says I'm ready to rule quite like defying the Pope, your king, and several foreign powers all at the same time. The secret negotiations were like something out of a spy thriller. Messages had to be smuggled between courts, meetings arranged in neutral territories, and bribes distributed to keep the right people quiet. Isabella's supporters, led by Archbishop Alfonso Carrillo, worked behind the scenes to make the impossible happen. They forged papal dispensations, arranged clandestine meetings, and basically ran a medieval covert operation. Meanwhile, Isabella had to play the perfect obedient princess in public while secretly planning the most rebellious act of her young life. She attended court functions, smiled at inappropriate suitors, and gave every appearance of being a dutiful royal daughter who would marry whomever her king commanded. But behind the scenes, she was orchestrating her own destiny with the precision of a chess master. The logistics alone were insane. Ferdinand had to sneak across enemy territory disguised as a merchant. Imagine a royal prince cosplaying as a traveling salesman, complete with fake papers and a donkey cart full of supposed trade goods. Isabella had to coordinate her location so they could meet without arousing suspicion, all while maintaining plausible deniability if the plan went sideways. But here's what makes this story fascinating. Isabella wasn't just rebelling against an unwanted marriage. She was making a calculated political decision that would reshape European history. She understood that her choice of husband would determine whether Spain remained a collection of fractured kingdoms or became a unified empire capable of challenging France and expanding beyond Europe. On October 19, 1469, in a small ceremony in Valladolid, Isabella and Ferdinand were married in what was essentially history's most consequential elopement. The papal dispensation they used, totally forged. The legal authority for the ceremony, questionable at best. The political ramifications, absolutely explosive. The reaction was swift and predictably dramatic. Enrique I was furious. This was basically his sister giving him the medieval equivalent of the middle finger. Foreign courts were alarmed, because their carefully laid plans for controlling Castilian succession had just gone up in smoke, and the church was in an awkward position, because they'd technically blessed a marriage that their own pope had forbidden. But Isabella had made her choice, and she'd made it with full knowledge of the consequences. She'd chosen a partner who shared her vision of what Spain could become, rather than accepting a marriage that would make her a pawn in someone else's game. Looking back, this single decision, a 19-year-old woman choosing her own husband against the wishes of kings and popes, would lead directly to the funding of Columbus's voyage, the Spanish conquest of the Americas, and the creation of the first truly global empire. Not bad for a teenage rebellion. But marriage, as Isabella was about to discover, was just the beginning of her problems. Being married to the right person is one thing, actually getting to rule together is something else entirely. And unfortunately for Isabella, medieval succession politics made modern corporate hostile takeovers look like friendly neighborhood disagreements. The real game was just beginning, and the stakes were about to get much, much higher. Remember how we mentioned that Isabella wasn't originally supposed to be queen? Well, by 1470, that technicality was about to become everyone's problem. Her half-brother Enrique V had finally managed to produce an heir, a daughter named Juana, but there was just one tiny kingdom-destroying issue. Absolutely nobody believed she was actually his child. Medieval royal courts were basically reality TV shows with crowns and significantly higher stakes. Everyone knew everyone's business, especially when it came to royal bedrooms. And in Enrique's case, the gossip was particularly brutal. His nickname was Enrique the Impotent, which wasn't exactly subtle royal commentary. When Queen Juana of Portugal suddenly became pregnant after years of a childless marriage, the timing was suspicious. The whispers started immediately. Courtiers pointed out that the child looked remarkably like Beltrán de la Cueva, Enrique's favorite courtier, and the man who seemed to spend an unusual amount of time with the queen. Little Juana became known as La Beltraneja, essentially Beltrán's girl, which was medieval Spanish for we all know what really happened here. But here's where it gets really complicated. Legitimate or not, Juana was officially recognized as Enrique's heir, which meant Isabella's path to the throne just became infinitely more difficult. She wasn't just competing with male relatives anymore. She was potentially displacing a child whose only crime was existing in a very complicated family situation. The nobles of Castile looked at this succession crisis and saw opportunity. Some supported Juana's legitimacy because it meant they could potentially control a weak king through a child queen. Others backed Isabella because they believed in her competence and her alliance with Ferdinand, and a few were just waiting to see which side would offer them better terms before committing to anyone. Isabella found herself in an impossible position: support the child, and accept that she'd never rule Castile, challenge Juana's legitimacy, and she'd essentially be calling a little girl a bastard on a public stage. Neither option was particularly appealing for someone trying to build a reputation as a just and honorable ruler. The situation exploded in 1470 when a group of nobles decided they'd had enough of Enrique's ineffective rule. They declared his brother Alfonso, Isabella's younger brother, to be the rightful king. Suddenly what had been a succession dispute became a civil war, with armies forming around rival claimants and families choosing sides that would determine their futures for generations. Isabella watched her teenage brother being pushed into a role he never wanted, surrounded by ambitious men who saw him as a puppet they could control. Alfonso was gentle, scholarly, and completely unprepared for the brutal realities of medieval politics. He was everything Isabella wasn't, which made him the perfect figurehead for nobles who wanted a king they could manipulate. But the civil war that followed wasn't the glamorous medieval combat you see in movies. It was brutal, messy, and economically devastating. Armies stripped the countryside bare, trade routes became dangerous, and ordinary people suffered while nobles played their power games. Isabella got a front row seat to see what happened when royal succession became a blood sport. Then, in 1468, everything changed again. Alfonso died suddenly, possibly from plague, possibly from poison, definitely at the worst possible moment. The rebels who had supported him were left without a figurehead, and suddenly everyone's eyes turned to Isabella. Would she press her brother's claim? Would she accept Enrique's authority? Would she start her own rebellion? Isabella made a choice that revealed everything about her character. She refused to be crowned as a rival queen. Instead, she negotiated. She met with Enrique and worked out an agreement that recognized her as his legitimate heir, displacing Juana in the succession. It was a masterpiece of political maneuvering. She got what she wanted without having to wage war against a child. The Treaty of the Bulls of Gisando seemed to solve everyone's problems. Enrique kept his throne for life. Isabella was recognized as his heir, and the civil war could finally end. Everyone could go back to the normal level of medieval political scheming instead of the exhausting business of actual warfare. But there was a catch. There's always a catch. The treaty specified that Isabella couldn't marry without Enrique's consent, which meant her secret marriage to Ferdinand had technically invalidated the entire agreement. Oops. When news of the marriage broke, Enrique was predictably furious. He declared the treaty void and reinstated Juana as his heir. Isabella found herself back where she started, except now she'd burned her bridges with the king and bet everything on her alliance with Ferdinand. The kingdom began choosing sides again, but this time the lines were clearer. It wasn't just about legitimacy anymore. It was about what kind of rulers Castile wanted. Isabella and Ferdinand represented unity, military competence, and aggressive expansion. Juana represented continuity, Portuguese influence, and a more cautious approach to governance. What Isabella understood, and what made her dangerous, was that this wasn't really about bloodlines or legal technicalities. It was about power, pure and simple. The nobles would support whoever could offer them the most attractive combination of rewards and security. The church would back whoever seemed most likely to advance their interests, and the people would follow whoever could provide stability and prosperity. She'd learned to play the game by its real rules, not its official ones, and she was about to discover just how high the stakes could go when you're gambling with kingdoms. The stage was set for a final confrontation that would determine not just who ruled Castile, but what Spain itself would become. And Isabella was done being patient. December 11th, 1474. King Enrique I dies in Madrid. And within hours the most consequential succession crisis in Spanish history begins, because apparently medieval royal deaths came with the same timing as modern software updates. Always at the worst possible moment, and guaranteed to break everything. Picture the scene. Enrique's body is barely cold when messengers start racing across Castile, carrying news that will reshape Europe. But here's the thing about medieval communication. It moved at horse speed, which meant different parts of the kingdom got different versions of the story, depending on who reached them first and what agenda they were pushing. Isabella was in Segovia when she got the news, and her reaction tells you everything you need to know about her character. She didn't wait for official confirmation. She didn't convene councils or seek permission from nobles. She walked straight to the main church, had herself proclaimed Queen of Castile, and essentially dared anyone to argue with her. This wasn't just bold, it was strategically brilliant. In medieval politics, possession was 9/10 of the law, and being first to claim the throne could make all the difference. Isabella understood that legitimacy wasn't just about bloodlines. It was about who could project power most convincingly in the crucial first days after a king's death. But meanwhile, in Portugal, 12-year-old Juana was also being proclaimed Queen of Castile. Her supporters argued that Enrique's final will had reaffirmed her as his legitimate heir, making Isabella's claim nothing more than a political coup. 2 queens, 1 kingdom, and absolutely nobody willing to back down. The international implications were staggering. France immediately threw its support behind Juana, because a Portuguese-influenced Castile would be much more manageable than a unified Spain under Isabella and Ferdinand. Portugal's King Afonso V saw an opportunity to potentially add Castile to his territories through his niece's claim, and various Castilian nobles began calculating which side would offer them better terms. Ferdinand was still in Aragon when the crisis began, dealing with his own royal duties, which meant Isabella was essentially ruling alone during the most dangerous period of the succession dispute. Think about that for a moment, a 23-year-old woman, claiming a throne with questionable legal authority, facing opposition from foreign kingdoms and domestic rebels, and she's doing it without her co-ruler by her side. The military situation was particularly grim. Isabella's treasury was nearly empty, Enrique hadn't exactly been fiscally responsible, and she had no standing army to speak of. Her supporters were mostly in the northern cities, while much of the nobility remained neutral or actively hostile. Portugal was mobilizing forces to back Juana's claim, and France was providing financial support to Isabella's enemies. But Isabella had something her opponents didn't. She understood that this war would be won or lost based on who could convince the Castilian people that they represented the better future. This wasn't just about noble bloodlines. It was about whether Spain would remain a fragmented collection of competing interests or become something unified and powerful. Her first crucial decision was financial. The royal treasury was essentially broke, but Isabella needed money for armies, diplomacy, and the kind of royal display that convinced people she was actually in control. So she did something unprecedented. She pawned the crown jewels, not secretly but publicly, making it clear that she was literally betting everything she owned on her success. This gesture was pure political theatre, and it worked brilliantly. It showed that Isabella wasn't just another noble playing power games. She was someone willing to risk everything for Castile. It also demonstrated confidence in her ultimate victory, because you don't pawn crown jewels unless you're certain you'll be able to redeem them later. Ferdinand finally arrived from Aragon in January 1475, but his presence created as many problems as it solved. The Aragonese and Castilian courts had very different traditions, and many Castilian nobles were suspicious of foreign influence. Isabella had to carefully balance her partnership with Ferdinand against the need to appear as an authentically Castilian ruler. The couple's solution was ingenious. They created a joint monarchy, where each ruled their inherited territories independently, but governed together in matters affecting both kingdoms. It was a completely novel constitutional arrangement that made them true co-rulers rather than king and consort. Isabella wasn't just Ferdinand's wife who happened to be queen. She was an equal partner in power, but their opponents weren't sitting idle. In May 1475, Afonso V of Portugal invaded Castile with a substantial army, intending to marry Juana himself and claim the Castilian throne through conquest. This wasn't just a succession dispute anymore, it was a full-scale international war with the future of Spain hanging in the balance. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Isabella, who had once been dismissed as just another royal daughter to be married off for political advantage, was now facing armies led by kings who thought they could take her kingdom by force. The shy teenager who had defied everyone to marry Ferdinand was now commanding military strategy against seasoned rulers who had underestimated her completely. As armies began maneuvering across the Castilian landscape, Isabella made another decision that would define her reign. She wouldn't just defend her claim from a castle somewhere safe. She would take personal command of the war effort, traveling with her forces and demonstrating that she wasn't a queen who ruled from comfort while others fought for her. The stage was set for a conflict that would determine whether Isabella would become one of history's great rulers, or just another failed claimant whose story ended with exile or execution. And she was about to prove that being underestimated could be the most dangerous mistake her enemies could make. May 1475, King Afonso V of Portugal crosses into Castile with 5,600 men, convinced he's about to add another kingdom to his collection. His plan was actually pretty solid on paper. Marry 12-year-old Juana, claim the Castilian throne through her, and present Isabella with a fait accompli she couldn't possibly resist. What could go wrong with invading a country ruled by a woman who'd already proven she didn't respond well to people telling her what to do? Afonso had reason for confidence. He was an experienced military commander who'd successfully expanded Portuguese territory in North Africa. His army was well-trained and well-equipped. He had French financial backing, support from several Castilian nobles, and what appeared to be the stronger legal claim through Juana. On paper, this should have been a quick and decisive victory. Isabella's situation looked desperate. Her treasury was still empty despite pawning the crown jewels. Her military consisted mainly of urban militias, and whatever nobles had chosen to support her, plus Ferdinand's Aragonese forces, which were still arriving piecemeal. She was facing not just a foreign invasion, but a civil war where roughly half of her supposed subjects were either neutral or actively hostile. But here's what Afonso hadn't counted on. Isabella had spent the last 5 years studying exactly this scenario. She'd watched Enrique struggle with rebellious nobles and foreign interference, and she'd figured out something crucial about Spanish politics. The kingdom's power wasn't centralized in royal armies. It was distributed among fortified cities that could choose to open or close their gates based on who they thought would win. Isabella's strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. She would turn the war into a contest of legitimacy rather than just military strength. Every city that declared for her was proof that the Castilian people recognized her as their rightful queen. Every noble who joined her cause demonstrated that she represented continuity rather than foreign conquest. Her first major victory wasn't military, it was diplomatic. The crucial city of Toro had initially declared for Juana, but Isabella's agents managed to convince the city council to switch sides. When Afonso arrived expecting to find a friendly base of operations, he instead faced closed gates and hostile archers. His invasion was already going off script. Meanwhile, Isabella was doing something unprecedented for a medieval queen. She was personally directing military operations, not from a safe distance but actually traveling with her forces, inspecting fortifications, and coordinating strategy. Medieval chronicles describe her wearing armor and addressing troops before battles, which was so unusual that foreign observers initially didn't believe the reports. The psychological impact was enormous. Isabella wasn't just another royal figurehead. She was a war leader who shared the risks with her soldiers. When cities saw their queen personally defending Castilian independence, it became much easier to choose sides. This wasn't just about competing claims anymore. It was about Spanish pride versus foreign conquest. Ferdinand proved to be the perfect military complement to Isabella's political strategy. While she worked to secure cities and manage noble alliances, he handled field operations and siege warfare. Their partnership was so effective that Portuguese and French observers began referring to them as a single entity, los reyes, the monarchs, rather than treating them as separate rulers. The war settled into a pattern that favored Isabella's strengths. Afonso could win battles, but he couldn't win the underlying political contest. Every month that passed without a decisive Portuguese victory made Isabella's claim look stronger and more legitimate. Cities that had initially stayed neutral began declaring for her as it became clear she could actually defend her kingdom. But the real turning point came in March 1476 at the Battle of Toro. This wasn't just another medieval skirmish, it was a carefully orchestrated set piece that would determine whether Portugal could maintain its invasion or would be forced to retreat. Both sides knew that military momentum often mattered more than casualty counts in medieval warfare. The battle itself was tactically inconclusive. Both sides claimed victory, both suffered significant losses, and the immediate military situation didn't change dramatically. But strategically, it was a disaster for Afonso. He'd invaded Castile, promising quick victory and decisive conquest. Instead, he'd fought a costly battle against a queen who was still very much on her throne, and still very much in control of most of her kingdom. More importantly, Toro demonstrated that Isabella and Ferdinand could meet Portuguese forces in open battle and hold their own. This wasn't a weak queen hiding behind castle walls while foreign armies carved up her territory. This was a military partnership that could defend Castilian independence against anyone who challenged it. The international implications rippled across Europe. France had backed the Portuguese invasion expecting easy success, but now faced the prospect of a unified Spain that would be strong enough to challenge French interests. The Pope, who had initially been neutral, began showing more sympathy for Isabella's cause, as it became clear she was likely to win, and various Italian states started reconsidering their diplomatic positions based on this new Spanish power. But perhaps the most important consequence was psychological. Isabella had faced her greatest crisis, foreign invasion combined with domestic rebellion, and not only survived but emerged stronger. She'd proven to her own nobles that she could defend the kingdom, to foreign powers that Spain wouldn't be an easy target, and to herself that she was capable of the kind of decisive leadership that medieval kingship required. By late 1476, the Portuguese invasion was clearly failing. Afonso controlled only a few isolated strongholds. His French support was wavering, and more Castilian cities were declaring for Isabella every month. The question was no longer whether she would keep her throne, but how completely she would triumph over her enemies. The teenage girl who had once been considered a pawn in other people's political games had just outmaneuvered two kings and a major European power, and she was just getting started. September 4, 1479, the Treaty of Alcáçovas is signed, and suddenly, Isabella isn't just Queen of Castile anymore. She's the undisputed ruler of a unified kingdom that has just proven it can defeat foreign invasion and domestic rebellion simultaneously. But here's the thing about winning medieval civil wars. Victory doesn't mean you get to relax. It means you get to deal with all the people who bet against you and are now very nervous about their future prospects. The treaty itself was a masterpiece of diplomatic face-saving that let everyone pretend they hadn't been completely humiliated. Portugal got to keep its African territories and trading rights. France got to maintain its dignity by claiming they'd never really been fully committed to the invasion anyway. And Joanna got a comfortable retirement in a Portuguese convent. Isabella got everything she'd actually wanted: undisputed control of Castile and recognition of her legitimacy by every major European power. But winning a throne and actually ruling effectively are two completely different skill sets. As Isabella was about to discover, The kingdom she'd inherited was economically devastated, politically fractured, and administratively chaotic. 5 years of civil war had destroyed trade networks, emptied treasuries, and created a generation of nobles who were accustomed to basically ignoring royal authority whenever it suited them. Isabella's first priority was financial reconstruction, which sounds boring until you realize it was literally a matter of national survival. Medieval kingdoms couldn't function without reliable tax collection, and Castile's entire fiscal system had essentially collapsed during the succession crisis. Nobles had stopped paying taxes, cities had negotiated their own deals with whoever seemed likely to win, and the royal administration had been reduced to basically begging for funds. Her solution was characteristically direct. She personally toured the kingdom, renegotiating tax agreements and establishing her authority face-to-face with local leaders. This wasn't just about money, it was about demonstrating that royal power was real and consistent. When the Queen of Castile shows up at your city gates with an armed escort and wants to discuss your tax obligations, you pay attention. But Isabella understood that sustainable royal authority required more than just military intimidation. She needed to give her subjects reasons to support the monarchy beyond fear of punishment. So she began implementing a system of justice that was remarkably consistent and fair by medieval standards, which is to say, it was brutal to everyone equally rather than just picking on the powerless. The Hermandad, essentially a royal police force, was established to deal with crime and disorder that local authorities couldn't or wouldn't handle. These weren't just tax collectors with swords, they were representatives of royal justice who could override local nobles and enforce consistent legal standards across the kingdom. For the first time in decades, Castilian law meant the same thing whether you were in a major city or a remote village. Ferdinand's role in this reconstruction effort was crucial, but often overlooked by historians who focus on Isabella's more dramatic achievements. While she handled domestic policy and judicial reform, he managed military affairs and foreign relations. Their partnership was so effective that foreign diplomats often complained about the difficulty of playing one against the other. They seemed to operate as a genuinely unified political entity. But success brought new problems, particularly when it came to managing the nobles who had supported them during the Civil War. These weren't just allies, they were creditors who expected to be repaid for their loyalty, with lands, titles, and political influence. Isabella had to balance rewarding supporters without creating a new class of overmighty subjects who might challenge royal authority later. Her approach was typically clever. She created new opportunities for advancement that required ongoing royal favor, rather than just handing out permanent rewards. Military commands in the ongoing war against Granada, administrative positions in the expanding royal bureaucracy, and commercial privileges that depended on continued good behavior with the crown. Loyalty became profitable, but only as long as it continued. The kingdom's economic recovery was surprisingly rapid, partly because the end of civil war allowed trade to resume, but mostly because Isabella understood something about medieval economics that many rulers missed. Prosperity wasn't just about collecting taxes, it was about creating conditions where people could become wealthy enough to pay higher taxes. She invested royal resources in infrastructure, supported merchant activities, and promoted urban development. By 1480, Castile was not only financially stable but actually generating surplus revenue for the first time in decades. The crown jewels were redeemed from pawn, royal salaries were being paid regularly, and there was enough money in the treasury to start thinking about ambitious new projects, like for instance completing the conquest of Granada and potentially funding some very expensive exploration voyages. But perhaps the most important aspect of Isabella's post-war reconstruction was constitutional. She and Ferdinand had created something genuinely new in European politics, a dual monarchy where two rulers exercised equal authority over a unified state. This wasn't just a marriage alliance or a temporary military partnership. It was a completely novel form of government that would serve as a model for future Spanish expansion. The legal framework they established would later allow Spain to govern territories from the Netherlands to the Philippines as a unified empire, while respecting local traditions and customs. Isabella's insistence on shared authority with Ferdinand wasn't just about their personal relationship. It was about creating governmental structures flexible enough to handle unprecedented territorial expansion. By 1481, Isabella had transformed herself from a disputed claimant to one of Europe's most successful monarchs. She'd unified Castile, defeated foreign invasion, established effective royal authority, and created the economic and political foundations for what would become the world's first global empire. But all of this was just preparation for the decisions that would define her historical legacy. The war against Granada was about to begin, the Spanish Inquisition was about to be established, and a Genoese navigator named Columbus was about to present her with the most expensive and speculative business proposal in human history. The real Isabella, the one history would remember, was just getting started. Picture this, it's 4081, and Isabella is looking at a map of her newly unified kingdom when she notices something annoying. There, in the bottom right corner of Spain, is the Emirate of Granada, the last Muslim kingdom on the Iberian Peninsula. Still operating like it's 150 and the Reconquista is just a minor inconvenience that will eventually go away. For Isabella, Granada represented everything she couldn't tolerate about Spanish politics: divided authority, foreign influence, and the kind of medieval compromise that prevented kingdoms from reaching their full potential. Here was a Muslim state, technically a tributary of Castile, but functionally independent, controlling some of Spain's richest territory, while maintaining diplomatic relations with North African powers that could theoretically support future invasions. But this wasn't just about religious differences or territorial completeness, though those factors certainly mattered. Granada controlled crucial trade routes between Christian and Muslim territories, which meant substantial customs revenues that weren't flowing into Castilian treasuries. The emirate also represented a fundamental challenge to Isabella's vision of Spanish unity. How could she claim to rule a unified kingdom when part of it answered to a different sovereign? The decision to conquer Granada was vintage Isabella, strategically sound, religiously motivated, politically brilliant, and absolutely ruthless in its implications. She wasn't just planning to add territory to Castile. She was proposing to complete a process that had been underway for almost 8 centuries. The final conquest of Al-Andalus would transform Spain from a collection of Christian kingdoms with a Muslim neighbor into a unified Catholic state with unlimited potential for expansion. Ferdinand was initially skeptical about the entire project, which tells you something about how audacious Isabella's plan actually was. Granada was heavily fortified, defended by experienced armies, and backed by the wealth of North African trade networks. Previous Castilian attempts at conquest had generally ended in expensive stalemates or outright military disasters. This wasn't going to be a quick campaign, it would require sustained military commitment over multiple years. But Isabella had learned crucial lessons from her recent civil war experience. Military success in medieval warfare wasn't just about winning battles. It was about maintaining political will and economic resources long enough to achieve strategic objectives. She'd already proven that Castile could sustain extended military operations when the goals were clear and the leadership was competent. The military challenge was genuinely formidable. Granada's capital city was protected by the Alhambra, one of Europe's most sophisticated fortress complexes. The surrounding territory was mountainous, easily defended, and dotted with castles that would need to be reduced individually. The Emirates' armies were experienced, well-equipped, and fighting for their homeland. This wasn't going to be a matter of winning one decisive battle and dictating terms. Isabella's solution was characteristically systematic. She would treat the Granada conquest as a long-term engineering project, rather than a traditional medieval campaign. Instead of relying on feudal levies that could only campaign for short periods, she established a professional army funded by royal taxation. Instead of trying to storm fortified positions, she would use artillery and siege warfare to methodically reduce enemy strongholds. The economic implications were staggering. This war would cost more than any previous Castilian military operation, requiring sustained taxation, borrowed funds, and careful resource management over multiple years. Isabella essentially bet the kingdom's financial future on her ability to complete the conquest quickly enough to capture Granadan wealth before Castilian resources were exhausted. But she had advantages that previous Castilian rulers had lacked. The kingdom was now unified and politically stable, which meant tax collection was reliable and military service was consistent. The recent civil war had created a generation of experienced officers and soldiers who understood modern military techniques. And, perhaps most importantly, the conquest of Granada could be presented as a religious crusade that would attract international support and domestic enthusiasm. The propaganda campaign was as carefully planned as the military operations. Isabella presented the war as the completion of the Reconquista, the final act in Christianity's reconquest of Iberian territory from Muslim occupation. This wasn't just Castilian territorial expansion. It was a holy war that would restore Christian rule to lands that had been under Muslim control for over 7 centuries. International reaction was overwhelmingly positive, at least from Christian powers. The Pope granted special indulgences for participation in the Granada campaign, essentially promising spiritual rewards for military service. Various European courts provided financial support or volunteer soldiers, treating the war as a continuation of crusading traditions. Isabella had successfully transformed a territorial conquest into a pan-European religious cause. But the most important international consequence was psychological. By announcing her intention to conquer Granada, Isabella was essentially declaring that Spain was ready to compete with any European power. This wasn't defensive warfare or civil conflict. This was aggressive expansion by a unified kingdom that believed it could achieve whatever it attempted. The domestic impact was equally significant. The Granada War gave Isabella's recently unified nobility a common cause that channeled their military ambitions toward royal objectives rather than private feuds. Instead of fighting each other, Castilian and Aragonese nobles could compete for glory and plunder in service of their monarchs. The war became a safety valve that redirected aristocratic violence toward productive ends. As military preparations began in earnest during 1481, Isabella was making decisions that would reshape not just Spain, but the entire global balance of power. The wealth captured from Granada would fund Columbus's voyages. The military experience gained in the conquest would enable Spanish expansion in North Africa and Italy, and the administrative systems developed to manage the war effort would become the foundation for governing a global empire. But all of that was still in the future. In 1481, Isabella was simply a queen looking at a map and deciding that she didn't like having neighbors who didn't acknowledge her authority. The fact that this decision would lead to the Spanish conquest of the Americas was just a bonus she couldn't have imagined yet. Let's talk about what medieval siege warfare actually looked like, because Hollywood has given you completely wrong ideas about how kingdoms were conquered in the 15th century. The Granada War wasn't knights charging dramatically across fields while orchestral music swelled. It was 10 years of methodical engineering, economic logistics, and the kind of grinding military bureaucracy that would make modern defense contractors weep with appreciation. Isabella's approach to conquering Granada reads like a business plan, written by someone who'd been paying very close attention to recent military innovations. Instead of relying on traditional feudal armies that showed up when they felt like it and left when they got bored, she created what was essentially Europe's first professional military organization. Soldiers were paid regular salaries, equipment was standardized, and campaigns were planned with the kind of logistical detail that would make Amazon's supply chain managers proud. The artillery was the real game changer, and Isabella invested in cannon technology, with the enthusiasm of a tech startup founder discovering artificial intelligence. These weren't the massive, immobile siege guns that took weeks to position. These were relatively portable bronze cannons that could be moved between targets and deployed quickly enough to keep pace with military operations. For the first time in Iberian history, castle walls weren't automatic guarantees of safety. But here's what made Isabella's military strategy genuinely revolutionary. She understood that siege warfare was ultimately about economics, not heroics. Every fortified city that held out against Castilian forces was costing her money in soldier salaries, equipment maintenance, and opportunity costs. Every city that surrendered quickly was a financial victory that freed up resources for the next target. Her solution was to make surrender more attractive than resistance through a combination of generous terms and terrifying examples. Cities that opened their gates immediately kept their property and population intact. Cities that forced expensive sieges, well, let's just say that Isabella believed in object lessons that other cities would remember when making their own decisions. The siege of Alhama in 1482 set the pattern for everything that followed. This strategic fortress controlled access to Granada's heartland, making it an obvious first target. But instead of just attacking the walls until something broke, Isabella's forces surrounded the city completely, cutting off all trade and communication, while gradually destroying the fortifications with sustained artillery bombardment. The psychological pressure was as important as the military pressure. Alhama's defenders could see Castilian supply trains arriving regularly, bringing fresh equipment and reinforcements. They could hear the cannons being repositioned for better firing angles. They could watch their own walls being methodically reduced while knowing that no help was coming from Granada's capital. When Alhama finally fell, Isabella made sure the aftermath sent exactly the message she intended. The garrison was treated according to the laws of war, professionally and without unnecessary cruelty. The civilian population was protected, and their property rights were respected. but the city's strategic importance was eliminated by destroying its fortifications and installing a permanent Castilian garrison. This became the template for the entire war: demonstrate overwhelming force, offer reasonable surrender terms, and follow through on both promises and threats with absolute consistency. Cities that cooperated were protected. Cities that resisted were conquered. There were no exceptions, no special cases, and no negotiations about the fundamental terms. Ferdinand proved to be the perfect field commander for Isabella's strategic vision. While she managed the war's political and economic aspects from various administrative centers, he handled tactical operations with the kind of professional competence that medieval chroniclers found almost boring to describe. No dramatic heroics, no unnecessary risks, just methodical, effective military operations that achieved their objectives at minimal cost. The international dimension added another layer of complexity to what was already an incredibly ambitious undertaking. Granada's rulers appealed for support from North African Muslim powers, particularly the Marinid dynasty in Morocco. This meant Isabella wasn't just conquering Spanish territory. She was potentially fighting a war that could involve military intervention from across the Mediterranean. Her response was typically systematic. She established naval patrols to intercept North African reinforcements, while simultaneously launching diplomatic initiatives to discourage Moroccan intervention. The message was clear: Spain was prepared to defend its interests across multiple theaters simultaneously, and anyone thinking about supporting Granada should consider whether they were ready for a much larger conflict. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the Granada War was how Isabella managed to maintain domestic support for such an expensive and prolonged military commitment. Medieval kingdoms had a terrible track record when it came to sustaining multi-year campaigns, partly because nobles got distracted by their own affairs, and partly because treasuries typically ran out of money faster than wars reached conclusions. Isabella's solution was to make the war profitable for her supporters. Through a carefully managed system of plunder distribution and territorial grants, soldiers received regular pay plus shares of captured wealth. Nobles earned new lands and titles based on their military contributions. Cities that supported the war effort received favorable trade privileges and tax considerations. More importantly, she maintained the religious enthusiasm that had initially justified the campaign by ensuring that military successes were celebrated as spiritual victories. Every captured city meant more Christian territory, more souls saved from Muslim rule, and more evidence that God supported Isabella's cause. The war became a source of national pride rather than just royal ambition. By 4085, the pattern was clear to everyone involved. Granada's outer fortifications were falling systematically. Castilian control was expanding steadily, and the Emirates' ability to resist was diminishing with every passing season. What had begun as an audacious gamble was becoming an inevitable conclusion. But the most important consequence of the Granada War wasn't military, it was administrative. Isabella was creating governmental systems capable of managing complex, multi-year projects with precise coordination between different departments and territories. These same systems would soon be managing territories from the Caribbean to the Pacific. The woman who had once pawned crown jewels to pay for her first army was becoming the architect of history's most successful imperial administration, and she was still just getting started. November 1, 1478, Pope Sixtus IV issues a papal bull authorizing Isabella and Ferdinand to establish the Spanish Inquisition, and suddenly medieval Spain gets its own version of internal affairs. Except instead of investigating police corruption, they're investigating whether your religious conversion was sincere enough to avoid being burned at the stake, because nothing says unified kingdom quite like institutionalized religious terror. Let's be absolutely clear about what Isabella was creating here, because modern discussions of the Inquisition tend to get bogged down in either apologetic revisionism or sensationalized horror stories. The Spanish Inquisition was a systematic, bureaucratic and remarkably efficient instrument of state control that used religious orthodoxy as a pretext for political consolidation. It was brutal, it was effective, and it was entirely consistent with Isabella's approach to every other aspect of governance. The official justification was protecting Catholic orthodoxy from the corrupting influence of false converts, particularly Jews and Muslims who had converted to Christianity, but allegedly continued practicing their original religions in secret. These conversos and moriscos were supposedly undermining Spanish spiritual unity and needed to be identified, corrected, or eliminated for the good of everyone's souls. But here's what the Inquisition was really about. Isabella had inherited a kingdom where religious diversity meant political fragmentation. Jewish communities often maintained international connections that could complicate foreign policy. Muslim populations might sympathize with Granada or North African powers. Recent converts represented potential fifth columns, whose ultimate loyalties were uncertain. Religious uniformity meant political reliability. The bureaucratic structure Isabella established for the Inquisition was typically thorough and systematically terrifying. Local tribunals were staffed with trained legal professionals who followed standardized procedures for investigating suspected heresy. Cases were documented with obsessive detail, creating paper trails that could be reviewed by higher authorities. Appeals processes existed, but they were designed more to prevent administrative errors than to protect the innocent. The investigation methods were, let's call them, comprehensive. Suspected heretics were encouraged to confess voluntarily during a period of grace, when penalties would be relatively light. Those who didn't confess faced formal trials where anonymous accusers provided testimony and physical evidence was carefully evaluated. Torture was permitted during questioning, but only according to specific guidelines that ensured consistency across different tribunals. What made the Spanish Inquisition particularly effective was its integration with existing governmental and ecclesiastical structures. Inquisitors worked closely with local bishops, municipal authorities, and royal administrators to identify potential cases and coordinate investigations. This wasn't a separate religious organization operating independently. It was an extension of royal power that used theological expertise to achieve political objectives. The economic dimensions were as important as the spiritual ones, though they're often overlooked by historians who focus on the Inquisition's religious aspects. Convicted heretics faced confiscation of property, which meant the royal treasury benefited directly from successful prosecutions. Wealthy converso families were particularly attractive targets, because their assets could fund other royal projects, while eliminating potential sources of political opposition. Isabella personally supervised the Inquisition's establishment and early operations, demonstrating the same hands-on management style she'd used for military campaigns and administrative reforms. She appointed the first Inquisitor General, reviewed major cases, and established the procedural guidelines that would govern tribunals across Spanish territories. This wasn't delegated authority, it was direct royal involvement in religious policy. The psychological impact on Spanish society was immediate and profound. Families with Jewish or Muslim ancestry faced constant scrutiny of their religious practices, dietary habits, and social associations. Christian neighbors were encouraged to report suspicious behavior, creating networks of surveillance that extended into every community. The mere possibility of investigation influenced how people dressed, what they ate, and whom they associated with. But perhaps the most important consequence was international. By establishing the Spanish Inquisition, Isabella was declaring that Spain would enforce religious uniformity regardless of external pressure or traditional rights. Jewish communities that had existed since Roman times found their legal protections meaningless when confronted with systematic investigation of their Christian converts. Muslim populations discovered that nominal conversion wasn't sufficient to guarantee safety. The Inquisition's efficiency was remarkable and terrifying in equal measure. Between 1480 and 1530, Spanish tribunals investigated approximately 150,000 cases of suspected heresy, resulting in roughly 3,000 executions and tens of thousands of other punishments ranging from public humiliation to property confiscation. The conviction rate was over 95%, which tells you something about either the quality of the investigations or the presumptions built into the system. Foreign reactions ranged from horrified condemnation to nervous admiration, depending on each country's own religious and political situation. The Pope initially supported the Inquisition as a legitimate exercise of Catholic authority, but later became concerned about Spanish independence in religious matters. Other European monarchs watched carefully to see whether similar institutions might be useful for managing their own domestic religious minorities. The Inquisition also served Isabella's broader imperial ambitions by creating administrative precedents for governing religiously diverse populations. The procedures developed for investigating conversos in Castile would later be adapted for managing indigenous populations in the Americas. The bureaucratic structures used to coordinate tribunals across Spain would become models for colonial administration across multiple continents. By 1490, the Spanish Inquisition had achieved Isabella's primary objectives. Religious dissent had been suppressed, potential political opposition had been eliminated or neutralized, and Spanish society had been unified around Catholic orthodoxy enforced by royal authority. But these successes came with costs that would influence Spanish development for centuries. The expulsion of skilled artisans, merchants, and professionals weakened certain sectors of the Spanish economy. The climate of suspicion and conformity discouraged intellectual innovation and cultural diversity, and the international reputation for religious intolerance complicated Spanish diplomacy in contexts where religious flexibility might have been advantageous. But for Isabella, these were acceptable trade-offs for achieving the political unity that made everything else possible. The same religious orthodoxy that enabled the conquest of Granada would justify the expansion into North Africa and the Americas. The administrative systems that managed the Inquisition would govern territories from Mexico to the Philippines. The Iron Queen had forged Spanish unity through fire and faith, exactly as she'd always intended, and she wasn't finished yet. January 1492, Granada surrenders, and Isabella receives the keys to the Alhambra from the last Muslim ruler of Iberian Spain. After 10 years of siege warfare, economic pressure, and systematic conquest, the Reconquista is finally complete. Spain is unified under Christian rule for the first time since the Visigothic period, and Isabella has achieved something that had eluded Spanish monarchs for over 7 centuries. But if you think this was Isabella's biggest accomplishment of 1492, you're thinking way too small, because 3 months later, she's going to make a decision that will quite literally change the shape of the world map. The Granada surrender ceremony was political theatre at its most symbolic. The Boabdil, the last Nasrid ruler, formally handed over the city's keys while Isabella and Ferdinand received them from the Alhambra's towers, visible to both armies and all the civilians who had gathered to witness the historic moment. This wasn't just military victory, it was the completion of a religious and political project that had defined Spanish identity for centuries. But Isabella understood that military conquest was only the beginning of actual control. Granada's population was overwhelmingly Muslim, economically integrated with North African trade networks, and culturally distinct from Christian Spanish territories. Simply occupying the city wasn't sufficient. She needed to transform it into a genuinely Spanish possession that would never again threaten Spanish unity. Her initial approach was surprisingly moderate by medieval standards. The surrender agreements guaranteed religious freedom for Granada's Muslim population, protected their property rights, and allowed them to maintain cultural practices under Spanish sovereignty. Isabella seemed to be following the same pragmatic policies she'd used elsewhere. Consolidate political control first, worry about social integration later. But this moderation didn't last long, and the reasons tell you everything about Isabella's real priorities. Within a few years it became clear that Granada's Muslim population wasn't assimilating into Spanish Christian society quickly enough to suit royal expectations. Religious freedom was creating opportunities for continued cultural autonomy, which meant potential political resistance to Spanish authority. By 1499, Isabella had authorized Archbishop Francisco Jiménez de Cisneros to begin aggressive conversion campaigns that essentially eliminated religious freedom through administrative pressure and economic coercion. Muslims faced a choice: convert to Christianity or leave Spanish territory. Most chose conversion, creating another population of potential false Christians for the Inquisition to investigate. But the real action in 1492 was happening in Córdoba, where a Genoese navigator named Christopher Columbus was making the most audacious business proposal in human history. He wanted Isabella to fund a voyage west across the Atlantic Ocean to reach Asia by sailing in the opposite direction from every previous expedition. The plan was based on geographical calculations that were wrong, navigational assumptions that were untested, and economic projections that were wildly optimistic. Isabella's advisors thought Columbus was either delusional or fraudulent, possibly both. The Royal Council's official report concluded that his proposed voyage was uncertain and impossible for any educated person to undertake. The Portuguese had already rejected his proposal as scientifically unsound. The English and French had shown no interest. By any reasonable standard, this was exactly the kind of speculative investment that responsible monarchs avoided. So naturally, Isabella decided to fund it anyway. The decision-making process reveals everything about Isabella's approach to strategic risk-taking. She wasn't gambling based on Columbus's geographical theories. She was calculating based on political and economic realities that had nothing to do with whether Asia was actually reachable by sailing west. First, the potential rewards were unlimited. If Columbus actually managed to establish a western sea route to Asian markets, Spain would control the most valuable trade network in the world while bypassing Portuguese and Ottoman territories. The economic advantages would be so overwhelming that Spain could dominate European commerce indefinitely. Second, the actual costs were manageable. Columbus was asking for 3 ships, supplies for a year, and a crew of about 90 men. Even if the entire expedition was lost, Isabella would be out roughly the same amount she'd spend on a medium-sized military campaign. The downside risk was finite and acceptable. Third, the political implications favored Spain regardless of the voyage's success. Funding Columbus demonstrated Spanish confidence and ambition to other European powers. Even a failed expedition would show that Spain was wealthy enough and confident enough to attempt projects that other kingdoms considered impossible. But perhaps most importantly, Isabella understood that Columbus's geographical theories might be wrong, while his basic insight remained correct. European access to Asian markets was controlled by intermediaries, who extracted enormous profits while limiting European expansion possibilities. Any alternative route, whether Columbus's Western Passage or some other approach, would transform European economic relationships with Asia. The capitulations of Santa Fe, signed on April 17, 1492, gave Columbus unprecedented authority and potential rewards in exchange for the massive risks he was undertaking. If successful, he would become Admiral of the Ocean Sea, Viceroy of any territories he discovered, and entitled to 10% of all wealth generated by his discoveries. If unsuccessful, he would probably die at sea, and Isabella would be out the cost of 3 ships. By August, Columbus was sailing west into the Atlantic with royal authorization to claim any territories he discovered for the Spanish crown. Isabella had bet a relatively small amount of money on the possibility of infinite returns, while maintaining plausible deniability if the entire project ended in disaster. The psychological impact of funding Columbus was as important as the potential economic benefits. Isabella was demonstrating that Spanish power now extended beyond European politics into global possibilities. She was claiming the right to explore and potentially colonize territories that no European power had ever seen, based solely on her confidence in Spanish capabilities. When Columbus returned in March 1493 with news of successful landfall and contact with indigenous populations, Isabella's reputation for strategic vision was established permanently. She had simultaneously completed the Reconquista and initiated Spanish expansion beyond Europe, transforming Spain from a regional power into a potential global empire within a single year. 1492 would be remembered as the year everything changed, and Isabella was the person who had made most of those changes possible. March 15, 1493. Columbus returns to Spanish waters with news that will reshape European understanding of the world's geography, economics, and possibilities. He's brought gold samples, exotic plants, and 7 indigenous people as proof that he's reached the Indies by sailing west. There's just one small problem with his triumphant return. Almost everything he thinks he accomplished is completely wrong. Columbus is convinced he's found a western route to Asia and established contact with the subjects of the Great Khan. The islands he's explored are obviously part of the East Indies, and the mainland coast he's glimpsed must be the outskirts of China or Japan. The indigenous people he's encountered are clearly Indians living on the periphery of established Asian civilizations. His geographical theories have been vindicated, and Spain now controls the most valuable trade route in history. Isabella's reaction to Columbus's return reveals everything about her strategic thinking, and nothing about her geographical knowledge. She doesn't really care whether Columbus has reached Asia, found previously unknown territories, or discovered an entirely new continent. What matters is that Spanish ships have successfully crossed the Atlantic Ocean, established contact with populated territories, and returned with evidence of exploitable resources. The political implications are immediately obvious to everyone at the Spanish court. Portugal has spent decades developing sea routes around Africa to reach Asian markets, creating a monopoly that generates enormous wealth, while limiting other European powers' access to Eastern trade. If Columbus has actually found an alternative route, regardless of its exact geographical relationship to Asia, Spain has potentially broken Portuguese commercial dominance. But Isabella understands something that takes Columbus several more voyages to accept. The specific location of these new territories matters less than Spain's ability to control and exploit them. Whether the islands are part of Asia, or represent previously unknown lands, they contain populations that can be converted to Christianity, resources that can be extracted for Spanish benefit, and strategic positions that can support further exploration. The economic potential is staggering even if Columbus's geographical assumptions are completely incorrect. The gold samples he's brought back suggest mineral wealth that could fund extensive Spanish military and political projects. The agricultural products indicate territories capable of supporting profitable colonial development, and the indigenous populations represent both potential converts to Christianity and sources of labor for Spanish economic enterprises. Isabella's immediate priority is securing Spanish legal title to whatever Columbus has discovered before other European powers can challenge Spanish claims. The papal bulls she obtains from Pope Alexander VI in 1493 grant Spain exclusive rights to territories discovered by sailing west, while Portugal retains its established claims to territories reached by sailing east around Africa. These intercatetra bulls are diplomatic masterpieces that manage to satisfy both Spanish and Portuguese interests, while establishing legal frameworks for future colonial expansion. Spain gets exclusive access to western exploration routes and any territories discovered through Atlantic voyages. Portugal keeps its African trade networks and eastern expansion possibilities. Both kingdoms avoid immediate conflict while positioning themselves for unlimited future growth. But the real genius of Isabella's approach to Columbus's discoveries is how she balances immediate exploitation with long-term strategic development. Other medieval rulers might have focused entirely on extracting maximum short-term wealth from new territories, potentially exhausting their resources and destroying their colonial potential. Isabella instead establishes administrative systems designed to maintain Spanish control indefinitely while developing sustainable sources of revenue. The colonial governance structures she creates for Spanish territories in the Caribbean become templates for managing much larger and more complex territories. The Spanish exploration expands. Local administrators are appointed directly by the Spanish crown and report through established bureaucratic channels. Indigenous populations are incorporated into Spanish legal and economic systems through carefully defined relationships that protect Spanish interests while maintaining social stability. Columbus's subsequent voyages reveal both the extent of his geographical errors and the magnitude of Spanish opportunities in the territories he's discovered. The Caribbean islands aren't part of Asia. They're previously unknown territories inhabited by indigenous civilizations that have never had contact with European, African, or Asian societies. The mainland coast isn't China, it's an entirely separate continent with its own complex political and economic systems. Isabella's response to these revelations demonstrates the flexibility and pragmatism that characterize all her major decisions. Instead of being disappointed that Columbus hasn't found Asia, she recognizes that he's found something potentially more valuable: territories that Spain can control completely, rather than simply accessing through diplomatic and commercial arrangements with existing Asian powers. The administrative challenges of governing Caribbean territories provide crucial experience for managing the much larger colonial empire that Spanish exploration will eventually create. The systems Isabella develops for coordinating between Spanish and colonial authorities, managing indigenous populations, and extracting colonial resources become standard procedures that will be adapted for territories from Mexico to the Philippines. But perhaps the most important consequence of Columbus's voyages is psychological. Isabella has demonstrated that Spanish power isn't limited by European geography or traditional political boundaries. Spain can project authority across ocean distances, establish control over territories that other European powers have never seen, and create wealth through colonial expansion rather than just European conquest. The international reaction ranges from grudging admiration to barely concealed alarm, depending on each country's relationship with Spanish interests. Portugal initially protests Spanish claims to Western territories, but eventually accepts papal arbitration that preserves Portuguese access to Eastern trade routes. France and England begin considering their own exploration possibilities, recognizing that Spanish success has created new forms of international competition. By 1500, Isabella's gamble on Columbus has generated returns that exceed even her most optimistic projections. Spanish territories in the Caribbean are producing gold, sugar, and other valuable commodities. Spanish exploration has revealed the existence of continental territories with enormous potential for future development, and Spanish colonial administration has proven capable of governing diverse populations across transcontinental distances. The teenage girl who once pawned crown jewels to fund her first army has become the architect of history's first global empire, and she's accomplished this transformation by making a series of calculated risks that her contemporaries considered either impossible or insane. But the Columbus voyages are just the beginning of Spanish expansion, not its culmination. Isabella is about to discover that finding new continents creates as many problems as opportunities. By 1500, Isabella is facing a problem that no European monarch has ever had to solve before. How do you govern territories that are larger than your home kingdom, populated by people who have never heard of Christianity, and located on the other side of an ocean that takes months to cross? It's like trying to manage a startup that suddenly became a multinational corporation overnight, except the employees speak different languages, and some of them think you're a deity. The administrative challenges were genuinely unprecedented in European history. Medieval kingdoms were governed through personal relationships between monarchs and nobles, who shared cultural assumptions, legal traditions, and religious beliefs. Spanish colonial territories contained millions of people who had completely different social structures, economic systems, and spiritual practices. Traditional European governmental methods simply didn't apply. Isabella's solution was characteristically systematic. She would create entirely new institutions specifically designed for colonial governance, while adapting successful Spanish administrative practices to American conditions. The Casa de Contratación, established in Seville in 1503, became the central bureaucracy for managing all Spanish colonial activities. Every colonial appointment, every trade shipment, and every legal dispute had to be processed through this single administrative center. Think about the logistical complexity for a moment. Communications between Spain and the Caribbean took months, even under ideal conditions. Weather, pirates, and navigational errors could delay messages for additional months or eliminate them entirely. Isabella was trying to maintain centralized control over territories where her orders might not arrive for half a year, and responses to her questions might take a full year to reach her. But the real challenge wasn't logistical. It was moral and legal. Spanish colonial expansion had created contact with indigenous populations who clearly had their own political systems, property rights, and cultural traditions. What legal authority did Spain have to impose Spanish law on people who had never consented to Spanish rule? What moral justification existed for converting populations to Christianity against their will? Isabella's answer reveals both the strengths and limitations of medieval political thinking. Spanish authority in American territories derived from papal grants that assigned Spain the responsibility for bringing Christianity to populations who had never had the opportunity to accept salvation. Colonial governance wasn't conquest. It was missionary activity backed by sufficient military force to ensure success. This theological framework provided legal justification for Spanish expansion, while imposing moral obligations that shaped colonial policies in surprisingly significant ways. Spanish colonial law included extensive protections for indigenous populations, guarantees of fair treatment, and requirements that conversion to Christianity be voluntary rather than coercive. These weren't just theoretical principles, they were enforceable legal standards that colonial administrators violated at their own professional risk. The economic dimensions of empire were equally complex and unprecedented. American territories contained mineral wealth, agricultural potential, and trade opportunities that could generate enormous revenues for Spain. But extracting this wealth required substantial initial investments in infrastructure, transportation, and administrative systems that might not generate returns for years or decades. Isabella's approach was to treat colonial development as a long-term business venture, rather than a short-term extraction operation. Spanish colonial policy emphasized sustainable economic development that would continue generating wealth indefinitely rather than exhausting resources quickly for immediate profit. Colonial territories were expected to become permanent Spanish possessions, not temporary sources of plunder. The encomienda system she authorized represents both the possibilities and problems of this approach. Spanish colonists received grants of indigenous labor and tribute in exchange for providing military service and ensuring Christian instruction for indigenous populations. In theory, this created mutually beneficial relationships where Spanish colonists received economic resources, while indigenous people received protection and religious education. In practice, the encomienda system often became a mechanism for exploitation that violated both Spanish law and Christian moral principles. Colonial administrators were supposed to ensure that indigenous people were treated fairly and compensated appropriately for their labor. But the practical difficulties of enforcing these standards across vast distances with limited Spanish personnel meant that many encomiendas became essentially slavery operations disguised as legitimate labor arrangements. Isabella's response to reports of colonial abuses demonstrates her characteristic combination of moral concern and practical flexibility. She issued detailed legal codes that specified acceptable treatment of indigenous populations, established judicial systems for investigating complaints, and appointed officials specifically responsible for protecting indigenous rights, but she also recognized that complete elimination of colonial exploitation might make Spanish territories economically unviable. The Leyes de Burgos, promulgated in 1512, represent Isabella's attempt to balance moral obligations with economic necessities through detailed legal regulation of colonial relationships. Indigenous people were declared to be free subjects of the Spanish crown with specific rights and protections, but they were also required to provide labor and tribute to Spanish authorities as part of their obligations to Christian civilization. These legal frameworks established precedents that would influence Spanish colonial policy for centuries, while creating administrative structures capable of governing territories from Mexico to the Philippines. Isabella had essentially invented the concept of transcontinental empire governed through centralized bureaucracy rather than personal relationships between rulers and subjects. The international implications were equally significant. Spanish colonial success had demonstrated that European powers could establish control over previously unknown territories, extract enormous wealth from colonial development, and project military force across oceanic distances. Other European kingdoms began planning their own colonial ventures, creating new forms of international competition that would reshape global politics. But perhaps the most important consequence of Isabella's colonial policies was demographic and cultural. Spanish expansion had created the world's first genuinely global civilization, where Spanish law, Christian religion, European economic systems were being adapted to American conditions by populations that included Spanish colonists, indigenous Americans, and eventually African slaves imported to supplement colonial labor forces. By 1504, Isabella had transformed Spain from a recently unified European kingdom into the administrative center of a transcontinental empire that was still expanding rapidly. Spanish territories in the Caribbean were generating substantial revenues. Spanish exploration was revealing additional territories with enormous potential, and Spanish colonial systems were proving capable of governing diverse populations across unlimited distances. The shy teenage girl who had once been considered a minor player in European marriage negotiations had become the architect of the world's first global empire. But managing an empire, as Isabella was discovering, required different skills than building one. By 1504, Isabella has achieved literally everything she set out to accomplish when she claimed the Castilian throne 30 years earlier. Spain is unified, Granada is conquered, the Reconquista is complete, Spanish territories span 2 continents, and her kingdom has become the wealthiest and most powerful state in Europe. She should be celebrating the most successful reign in Spanish history. Instead, she's dying slowly in the royal palace at Medina del Campo, wondering whether her life's work will survive her death. The personal costs of Isabella's political success had been accumulating for decades, but they become impossible to ignore as her health begins failing in her early 50s. The woman who had once toured battlefields in armor and personally supervised siege operations can barely manage the physical demands of basic royal ceremonies. The stress of governing an empire while maintaining domestic political stability has literally consumed her body's ability to function. But the real tragedy isn't Isabella's physical decline. It's watching her carefully constructed political legacy begin crumbling before her eyes. The succession crisis she'd spent her entire reign trying to prevent is developing anyway, driven by circumstances she couldn't have anticipated and family dynamics she couldn't control. Her eldest child, Isabella, had been groomed from birth to inherit the throne and continue Spanish unification policies. She was intelligent, well-educated, politically astute, and married to Manuel I of Portugal, a union that could potentially unite the entire Iberian Peninsula under Spanish-Portuguese cooperation. Everything about the succession seemed perfectly arranged until Isabella died in childbirth in 1498, leaving only an infant son whose survival was uncertain. The backup plan had been Juana, Isabella's second daughter, who was equally intelligent and had been married to Philip the Handsome of Burgundy to cement Spanish-Austrian alliance relationships. But Juana's mental health had begun deteriorating shortly after her marriage, manifesting symptoms that resembled her grandmother Isabella of Portugal's psychological problems. By 1504, it's becoming clear that Juana is experiencing what modern medicine would recognize as severe depression or bipolar disorder. Isabella is facing the nightmare scenario she'd fought her entire life to avoid, a succession crisis where the legal heir is mentally incapable of effective rule, the backup options are either dead or unsuitable, and foreign powers are positioning themselves to exploit Spanish political instability. Everything she's built could collapse, simply because medieval medicine can't treat psychological disorders. Philip the Handsome represents everything. Isabella has always opposed about Spanish politics, foreign influence, noble factional conflict, and governance subordinated to dynastic rather than national interests. As Juana's husband, he has legitimate claims to Spanish authority, but his real loyalties are to Burgundian and Austrian interests that might conflict with Spanish needs. If Philip gains control over Spanish government, Isabella's vision of unified Spanish independence could be destroyed within years. The colonial empire adds another layer of complexity to the succession crisis. Spanish territories in the Americas require strong, consistent leadership to maintain administrative effectiveness and continue economic development. Political instability in Spain could trigger colonial rebellions, economic disruption, or foreign interventions that would eliminate Spanish advantages in global competition. Isabella has created an empire that depends on Spanish political stability for its continued existence. But perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of Isabella's final years is watching her relationship with Ferdinand deteriorate under the pressure of succession planning and personal grief. They had been genuine partners in building Spanish power, sharing authority and responsibility in ways that were unprecedented in European monarchy. But Juana's mental illness and Philip's political ambitions have created conflicts between Castilian and Aragonese interests that threaten their personal and political partnership. Ferdinand's position is particularly complicated because he has legitimate claims to continue governing Castile as Juana's regent if she's declared mentally incompetent. But these same claims make him appear to be pursuing personal power rather than Spanish national interests. His age, he's several years older than Isabella, and likely to die within the next decade, means that any regency arrangement would be temporary at best. Isabella's response to these cascading crises reveals both her strengths and limitations as a political leader. She continues working to establish administrative systems that can function effectively regardless of who occupies the throne, creating bureaucratic continuity that might survive political disruption. She negotiates international agreements that protect Spanish interests even if future rulers make different strategic choices. And she tries to prepare Juana for royal responsibilities despite her obvious psychological limitations. But there's only so much institutional preparation can accomplish when fundamental problems involve personality disorders and family dynamics that can't be solved through legal documents or administrative reforms. Isabella can establish procedures for governance, but she can't guarantee that future rulers will be mentally capable of following those procedures or politically committed to Spanish rather than foreign interests. The international situation makes everything worse, because other European powers are obviously preparing to exploit Spanish succession problems for their own advantage. France is positioning itself to challenge Spanish territorial claims in Italy and the Netherlands. Portugal is reconsidering its relationship with Spanish colonial expansion, and various German princes are calculating whether Habsburg succession in Spain creates opportunities for advancing their own dynastic interests. Isabella's final political acts focus on damage control rather than new achievements. She revises her will multiple times to provide the clearest possible legal framework for succession, while protecting Castilian independence from foreign manipulation. She appoints executors and regents who are committed to Spanish interests rather than personal advancement, and she establishes endowments and institutional arrangements that will continue her religious and social policies regardless of future political changes. By November 1504, Isabella knows she's dying, and that her death will trigger exactly the kind of succession crisis she'd spent 30 years trying to prevent. The unified Spanish kingdom she'd created through war, diplomacy, and administrative innovation might not survive her death by more than a few years. The colonial empire she'd built could fragment into competing territories governed by different European powers. The Iron Queen, who had conquered kingdoms and funded global exploration, was discovering that even the most successful rulers can't control what happens after they're gone. November 26, 1504. Isabella lies dying in her chamber at Medina del Campo, dictating final additions to a will that reads like both a legal document and a political manifesto. She's trying to solve problems that extend decades into the future while managing physical pain that makes concentration nearly impossible. This isn't just estate planning. This is a desperate attempt to preserve Spanish unity and colonial empire against political forces she can anticipate but can't control. The testament she's creating reveals everything about Isabella's priorities and fears as her life reaches its conclusion. Religious concerns dominate the opening sections, with detailed instructions for masses, charitable donations, and spiritual arrangements that reflect her lifelong conviction that royal power carries divine obligations. But the political provisions tell the real story of what she's trying to protect and how uncertain she is about succeeding. Juana is formally confirmed as Isabella's successor, but the will includes carefully worded clauses that allow Ferdinand to serve as regent if Juana is unable or unwilling to exercise royal authority effectively. This language creates legal justification for bypassing Juana's mental health problems, without explicitly declaring her incompetent, a diplomatic solution to an impossible family situation. But Isabella understands that legal documents can't solve political problems if the people involved choose to ignore them. Philip the Handsome has his own claims to authority as Juana's husband, and he's backed by Burgundian and Austrian resources that could overwhelm Spanish resistance if Ferdinand lacks sufficient mystic support. The succession arrangements Isabella is creating might prevent civil war, but they can't guarantee political stability. The colonial provisions of her testament demonstrate Isabella's recognition that Spanish America represents both her greatest achievement and her most vulnerable legacy. She establishes detailed guidelines for colonial governance that emphasize protection of indigenous populations, sustainable economic development, and maintenance of Spanish administrative unity across transcontinental distances. These aren't just moral principles, they're practical political requirements for maintaining Spanish control over territories that could easily break away from European authority if colonial policies become exploitative enough to trigger widespread resistance. Isabella has learned from Portuguese colonial experiences in Africa and Asia that sustainable imperial control requires some balance between extraction and protection. But the most revealing aspect of Isabella's final testament is its international dimension. She includes specific instructions for maintaining Spanish independence from foreign influence, while honoring existing alliance commitments that serve Spanish interests. The document reads like a foreign policy manual, written by someone who understands exactly how vulnerable Spanish achievements could be to external manipulation during a succession crisis. Her provisions regarding the Inquisition and religious policy demonstrate Isabella's continued conviction that Spanish unity requires religious uniformity, but they also reveal growing concern about institutional overreach that could damage Spanish interests. The Inquisition is confirmed as a permanent Spanish institution, but with enhanced oversight mechanisms designed to prevent the kind of systematic corruption that had plagued other ecclesiastical organizations. Isabella's personal bequests tell their own story about the relationships that had sustained her through 30 years of political struggle. Ferdinand receives not just expressions of love and gratitude, but specific gifts that acknowledge his crucial role in Spanish achievements, while recognizing that their political partnership might not survive her death. She's saying goodbye to both a husband and a co-ruler whose future authority will depend on circumstances neither of them can predict. The arrangements for her funeral and burial reflect Isabella's understanding of royal ceremony as political communication. She requests burial in Granada, the city whose conquest had completed the Reconquista and demonstrated Spanish power to overcome centuries-old challenges. Her tomb would remind future generations that Spanish unity had been achieved through military victory rather than diplomatic compromise. But perhaps the most poignant aspect of Isabella's final weeks is her obvious awareness that personal will and political planning have their limitations when confronted with historical forces beyond any individual's control. She's done everything possible to protect Spanish interests and colonial empire through institutional arrangements and legal frameworks, but she knows that future events will depend on decisions made by people who might prioritize different objectives. Her final conversations with Ferdinand, recorded by contemporary chroniclers, reveal both the intimacy of their personal relationship and the complexity of their political partnership. They discuss immediate administrative problems, long-term strategic concerns, and personal regrets with the kind of detailed understanding that comes from sharing power for decades. But they also acknowledge uncertainties about whether their successors will be capable of maintaining what they've built together. Isabella's death on November 26, 1504, marks the end of an era in Spanish history that had lasted exactly 30 years. From her initial claim to the Castilian throne in 1474 to her final breath in Medina del Campo. During those 3 decades, she had transformed Spain from a fragmented collection of competing kingdoms into Europe's dominant power and the world's first global empire. The immediate aftermath of her death confirms many of her worst fears about succession politics and foreign intervention. Philip the Handsome arrives from Burgundy to claim authority over Castilian government, triggering exactly the kind of conflict between Spanish and foreign interests that Isabella had spent her entire reign trying to prevent. Juana's mental condition deteriorates further under the stress of widowhood and political pressure, making effective rule by the legitimate heir increasingly impossible. But the institutional foundations Isabella had established prove more durable than the political arrangements she'd hoped would preserve them. Spanish colonial administration continues functioning effectively, despite political uncertainty in Europe. The economic systems she'd created for managing imperial wealth continue generating revenue for Spanish interests, and the legal framework she'd established for governance prove adaptable enough to survive changes in royal personnel and political circumstances. Isabella's legacy would ultimately be measured not by whether her immediate succession plans succeeded, but by whether the Spanish empire she'd created could survive the inevitable political disruptions that follow any ruler's death. She'd built something larger and more complex than any previous European monarch had attempted. But she'd also created challenges that would test Spanish capabilities for centuries. The Iron Queen was gone, but the empire she'd forged from fire and faith would continue reshaping the world long after her death. Let's step back from the deathbed drama and palace intrigue for a moment and ask the question that actually matters. What did Isabella of Castile's life mean for the rest of human history? Because when you strip away the medieval politics and royal genealogies, you're left with a woman who fundamentally altered the trajectory of global civilization in ways that are still shaping our world 5 centuries later. First, there's the obvious stuff that appears in every history textbook. Isabella funded Columbus, which led to European colonization of the Americas, which triggered demographic, cultural, and economic changes that affected literally every society on Earth. Without her decision to gamble on hegemony as navigators' questionable geographical theories, the entire pattern of global development would have been completely different. But that's just the beginning of Isabella's historical impact, not its culmination. The Spanish Empire she created became the template for European colonial expansion, establishing the administrative, legal, and economic precedents that other powers adapted for their own imperial projects. The British Empire, the French colonial system, and even modern international development programs can trace their institutional DNA back to governmental structures Isabella invented for managing Spanish territories in the Americas. The religious and cultural consequences are equally significant and considerably more complicated. Isabella's version of Catholic Christianity, militant, institutionalized, and backed by state power, became the dominant form of Christianity in territories from Mexico to the Philippines. But it also triggered Protestant Reformation movements that permanently fractured European Christian unity and created religious conflicts that continue influencing international politics today. The Spanish Inquisition she established didn't just affect Spanish territories, it created international precedents for using religious orthodoxy as a tool of state control that influenced governmental policies across Europe for centuries. Modern totalitarian ideologies borrowed techniques and justifications that can be traced directly back to Inquisition practices. Isabella authorized in the 40s, but perhaps Isabella's most profound historical impact involves something that most people never think about. She proved that European societies could successfully govern transcontinental territories with completely different populations, environments, and economic systems. Before Spanish colonial expansion, European political authority had always been limited by geographical proximity and cultural similarity. Isabella's colonial empire demonstrated that technological advantages in navigation, military equipment, and administrative organization could enable relatively small European populations to establish control over much larger territories with vast indigenous populations. This discovery that technological superiority could overcome numerical disadvantages across unlimited distances fundamentally changed European expectations about what kinds of political projects were possible. The economic implications rippled through every aspect of global development. American gold and silver flowing into European markets triggered inflation that altered international trade relationships, financing patterns, and governmental fiscal policies across multiple continents. The wealth Isabella's colonial system extracted from the Americas funded European wars, architectural projects, and commercial expansion that wouldn't have been possible otherwise. But the demographic consequences were even more dramatic. European diseases introduced to American populations caused mortality rates that may have reached 90% in some regions, demographic catastrophes that eliminated entire civilizations, and created power vacuums that spanned colonial authorities, filled with imported European and African populations. Isabella's decisions triggered the Atlantic slave trade that transported millions of Africans to American territories as replacement labor for indigenous populations that had been decimated by epidemic diseases. The racial hierarchies and economic systems that developed in Spanish colonial territories established patterns of exploitation and discrimination that continue influencing social relationships throughout the Americas today. The technological and intellectual consequences are often overlooked but equally significant. Spanish colonial expansion required innovations in navigation, cartography, mining, agriculture, and dozens of other fields that advanced European technological capabilities, while providing new knowledge about geography, biology, and human societies that transformed European understanding of the natural world. Isabella's empire also created the world's first genuinely global communication networks, connecting territories in Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Americas through regular trade route, administrative correspondence, and missionary activities. Information, people, and resources could move between continents with unprecedented speed and reliability, creating economic and cultural integration on a scale that had never existed before. The political precedents Isabella established continue influencing international law and diplomatic practice today. The papal bulls that justified Spanish colonial expansion became templates for European claims to territorial sovereignty over indigenous populations. Modern concepts of territorial jurisdiction, colonial administration, and international legal authority can be traced back to frameworks Isabella's lawyers developed for governing Spanish colonial territories. But there's a darker legacy that's equally important to acknowledge. Isabella's success in using religious uniformity as a tool for political consolidation inspired centuries of persecution, ethnic cleansing, and cultural genocide carried out by governments that adapted her methods for their own purposes. The techniques she developed for identifying, investigating, and eliminating religious diversity became standard practices that were applied against Jewish, Muslim, Protestant, and indigenous populations throughout European and colonial territories. The administrative systems she created for extracting wealth from colonial territories established economic relationships between European and non-European societies that continue shaping global inequality patterns today. Modern debates about development aid, trade relationships, and cultural preservation often involve issues that originated with Spanish colonial policies Isabella established in the 40s. Perhaps most significantly, Isabella demonstrated that individual political decisions could have consequences that extend across centuries and continents. Her choice to fund Columbus, establish the Inquisition, and create Spanish colonial administration weren't just medieval policy decisions. They were actions that altered the fundamental trajectory of human civilization. Looking at Isabella's complete historical impact requires acknowledging both the remarkable achievements and the terrible costs of her reign. She created the foundation for European global dominance while triggering demographic catastrophes that eliminated entire civilizations. She established legal and administrative frameworks that enabled unprecedented international cooperation, while institutionalizing forms of discrimination and exploitation that continue causing suffering today. The Iron Queen of Fire and Faith had forged a legacy that was simultaneously magnificent and monstrous, exactly like the woman herself. And 5 centuries later, we're still living in the world she created. Here's something that gets lost in all the talk about military campaigns and colonial empires. Isabella of Castile was a human being with fears, doubts, relationships, and private moments that had nothing to do with reshaping global civilization. Behind all the political calculation and religious conviction was a woman who loved her children, worried about her marriage, and sometimes lay awake at night wondering whether she was making the right decisions for herself and her kingdom. The private Isabella emerges most clearly in her correspondence with family members and close advisors, documents that reveal someone far more emotionally complex than the Iron Queen persona she projected in public. Her letters to Ferdinand during their frequent separations show genuine affection and partnership, but also anxiety about managing royal responsibilities without his support. She missed him when duty required them to govern different territories, worried about his health during military campaigns, and sought his advice on decisions that she could have made independently. Her relationship with her children tells an even more complicated story about the intersection between personal and political obligations. Isabella genuinely loved her daughters and son, But she also understood that their marriages and career choices would determine Spanish diplomatic relationships for decades. Every decision about their education, social activities, and future spouses had to balance parental affection with dynastic necessity. The tragedy of her eldest daughter, Isabella's death in childbirth, devastated her in ways that contemporary observers found surprising in a queen who had demonstrated such emotional control during political and military crises. Courtiers reported that she wept openly, withdrew from public ceremonies, and required months to resume normal royal activities. The loss of her designated successor wasn't just a political problem, it was a mother's grief that challenged her ability to function as a ruler. Juana's mental health problems created even more complex emotional challenges. Isabella could see her daughter's psychological deterioration, but had no effective treatment options, and limited understanding of what was causing the symptoms. Medieval medicine offered no helpful interventions for what we would now recognize as severe depression or bipolar disorder. Isabella was watching her daughter suffer while knowing that Juana's condition threatened everything she'd worked to achieve. The religious dimension of Isabella's personality reveals similar complexity beneath apparent certainty. Her devotion to Catholic Christianity was genuine and profound, but it was also shaped by political circumstances and personal experiences that made faith both a source of strength and a burden of responsibility. She truly believed that royal power carried divine obligations, but she also used religious authority to justify political decisions that served Spanish interests. Her relationship with the Inquisition demonstrates this tension between personal conviction and political calculation. Isabella authorized investigation and punishment of religious nonconformity because she believed Spanish unity required religious uniformity, but she also worried about institutional overreach that could damage innocent people and weaken royal authority. Contemporary accounts describe her personally reviewing major Inquisition cases and occasionally intervening to moderate sentences that seemed excessive. But perhaps the most revealing aspect of Isabella's private life was her attitude toward her own power and achievements. Despite her obvious political success, she seems to have experienced ongoing uncertainty about whether she was fulfilling her responsibility effectively. Her personal confessor reported that she regularly sought guidance about whether specific policies were morally acceptable and politically wise. This self-doubt wasn't weakness, it was recognition that her decisions affected millions of people and could influence historical developments for centuries. Isabella understood the weight of her authority in ways that made casual use of power impossible. Every major decision required careful consideration of immediate and long-term consequences that extended far beyond her personal interests. Her physical health problems during the final years of her reign added another layer of personal struggle to her political responsibilities. Contemporary medical accounts suggest she suffered from what modern physicians would probably diagnose as kidney disease, accompanied by painful symptoms that made basic daily activities increasingly difficult. She was trying to govern a transcontinental empire while dealing with chronic pain and progressive physical weakness. The personal costs of Isabella's political success become most apparent when you consider what she had to sacrifice for royal obligations. She rarely had extended periods of privacy or relaxation, couldn't develop friendships that weren't influenced by political considerations, and had to maintain public composure even during personal tragedies. Every aspect of her life was subordinated to the requirements of effective governance. Her marriage to Ferdinand, despite its obvious political and personal success, required constant negotiation between their individual ambitions and shared objectives. They were both strong-willed rulers with their own ideas about policy and strategy, which meant their partnership involved ongoing diplomatic work even in private. They had to balance personal affection with political calculation in ways that would challenge any relationship. Isabella's approach to raising her children reveals the same complex balancing act between human emotion and royal necessity. She wanted them to be happy and fulfilled, but she also needed them to serve Spanish interests through strategic marriages and political alliances. Every parental decision had diplomatic implications that could affect international relationships for generations. The women who surrounded Isabella at court, her ladies-in-waiting, female relatives, and informal advisors, provided some relief from the masculine world of political and military affairs, but even these relationships were constrained by rank, protocol, and potential political complications. Isabella could never simply be friends with other women without considering how those relationships might affect her royal authority and political position. Looking at Isabella's complete life requires acknowledging both her remarkable achievements and the personal costs of those accomplishments. She created a unified Spanish kingdom and global empire, but she did it by subordinating every aspect of her personal life to political requirements. She was simultaneously one of history's most successful rulers, and a woman who sacrificed normal human relationships for the demands of power. The Iron Queen had forged Spanish greatness through fire and faith, but the woman behind the crown had paid prices that no amount of political success could fully justify. Her legacy would outlast the Roman Empire, but Isabella herself had experienced the isolation and responsibility that come with reshaping civilization. So here we are at the end of Isabella's story, except it's not really the end because the consequences of her decisions are still reshaping our world 5 centuries later. The teenage girl who once defied a king to marry the man she chose became the architect of modernity itself. The person who transformed medieval Europe into the beginning of our globalized, interconnected, impossible modern world. Think about what Isabella actually accomplished during her 53 years of life. She unified a fractured kingdom through military conquest and political negotiation. She completed a religious and territorial reconquest that had been underway for 8 centuries. She established the world's first transcontinental empire, governed through centralized bureaucracy. She funded exploration that revealed the existence of entire continents unknown to European geography, and she created administrative, legal, and economic systems that managed unprecedented diversity across unlimited distances. But perhaps more importantly, she proved that individual human decisions could have consequences that extend across centuries and continents. Isabella's choice to fund Columbus didn't just lead to Spanish exploration of the Americas. It triggered demographic, cultural, and economic changes that affected literally every society on Earth. Her decision to establish the Inquisition didn't just enforce religious conformity in Spain, it created precedents for state control over individual belief that influenced governmental policies worldwide. The world we live in today, with its global trade networks, transcontinental political institutions, and cultural exchanges that connect societies across multiple continents, is still essentially the world that Isabella created when she decided that Spanish power shouldn't be limited by European geography or traditional political boundaries. Her legacy is simultaneously magnificent and monstrous, exactly like the woman herself. Isabella established legal frameworks that protected indigenous populations from the worst excesses of colonial exploitation. But she also created economic systems that extracted enormous wealth from American territories at enormous human cost. She promoted cultural and intellectual exchange that expanded European understanding of the natural world, but she also triggered demographic catastrophes that eliminated entire civilizations. The technical and administrative innovations that Spanish colonial expansion required, improvements in navigation, cartography, mining, agriculture, and governmental organization, accelerated European technological development, and provided knowledge that influenced scientific and intellectual progress for centuries. But these same innovations also enabled forms of cultural destruction and economic exploitation that continue causing suffering today. Isabella's approach to governance, combining centralized authority with respect for local customs and traditions, became the template for managing political diversity that modern democratic institutions still use for dealing with multicultural populations and federal systems. But her methods for enforcing political unity through religious conformity also provided precedents for totalitarian ideologies that rejected pluralism as incompatible with effective governance. The financial systems she developed for managing imperial wealth established international banking and trade relationships that evolved into modern global capitalism. Spanish colonial revenues funded European economic development, architectural achievement, and territorial expansion that created the foundation for industrial revolution and technological advancement. But the same economic relationships also established patterns of international inequality and resource extraction that continue shaping global development today. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Isabella's historical impact is how completely it transformed European expectations about what kinds of political projects were possible. Before Spanish colonial expansion, European rulers had always been limited by geographical proximity, cultural similarity, and technological constraints that made transcontinental governance impossible. Isabella proved that European societies could successfully project authority across oceanic distances and establish control over territories with vastly different populations and environmental conditions. This discovery, that technological and organizational advantages could overcome geographical and demographic limitations, fundamentally changed European assumptions about international relationships and imperial possibilities. Every subsequent European colonial project was built on precedents that Isabella had established for Spanish expansion in the Americas. But there's also a more personal dimension to Isabella's legacy that gets overlooked in discussions of her historical impact. She demonstrated that women could exercise effective political authority in contexts where female rule was traditionally considered impossible or undesirable. Her partnership with Ferdinand created new models for shared governance that influenced royal marriages and political alliances across Europe. Isabella's success in balancing personal relationships with political obligations while maintaining authority over male nobles, foreign diplomats, and military commanders provided examples that encouraged other women to pursue political careers and challenged assumptions about gender limitations in leadership roles. She wasn't just a successful ruler who happened to be female, she was someone who expanded possibilities for women's participation in political life. The administrative systems she created for governing Spanish colonial territories were specifically designed to function effectively regardless of who occupied formal positions of authority. Isabella understood that sustainable imperial control required institutional continuity that could survive changes in royal personnel and political circumstances. These systems proved durable enough to maintain Spanish colonial unity for over 3 centuries. Looking at Isabella's complete life and legacy requires acknowledging both the extraordinary achievements and the terrible costs of her reign, while recognizing that moral judgment of medieval rulers requires understanding the contexts and constraints that shaped their decisions. Isabella made choices that seemed reasonable and necessary given the information and options available to her, even when those choices had consequences she couldn't have anticipated. The Iron Queen, who had conquered kingdoms and funded global exploration, had created something larger and more complex than any previous European ruler had attempted. But she had also generated problems and possibilities that would challenge human societies for centuries. Her legacy is still being written in every international treaty, every multicultural institution, and every global exchange that connects societies across continents. Isabella of Castile died over 500 years ago, but the world she created through fire and faith is still the world we're living in today. And whether that's ultimately a triumph or a tragedy probably depends on which part of her legacy you're experiencing at any particular moment. And that's the story of Isabella of Castile, a woman so complicated she makes your ex look emotionally stable, and so consequential she accidentally created the modern world while trying to complete a medieval religious war. Sweet dreams, and try not to think too hard about whether we're all still living in her empire.